Cowboy, is your mind between my legs all the time? Wild West love, suspense and danger. The small town of Red Hollow sat quietly in the middle of a wide desert. Dust often moved slowly through the streets, and the wooden buildings looked tired from years of sun and wind. Most days were peaceful. People worked hard, shared stories in the evening, and knew almost everyone in town. But one afternoon, something different happened. A lone cowboy rode into Red Hollow. His horse walked slowly down the dusty street, while people stopped what they were doing to look at him. The cowboy wore a brown hat that shaded his eyes. His coat was old but clean, and his boots were covered with road dust. He looked like a man who had traveled a long way. No one in Red Hollow had seen him before. The cowboy stopped in front of the town's only saloon, a wooden building with a faded sign that read Bennett's Place. He stepped down from his horse and tied the reins to a post. His movements were calm and quiet, as if he had no reason to rush. Inside the saloon, the air was warm and filled with quiet conversation. A few townspeople sat at tables drinking coffee and talking about their day. Behind the counter stood Clara Bennett. Clara was known by everyone in Red Hollow. She owned the saloon and ran it with confidence. She had sharp eyes, quick humor, and a strong personality. People respected her because she worked hard and spoke her mind. When the cowboy walked inside, the room became silent for a moment. Clara looked up from cleaning a glass and studied the stranger carefully. The cowboy removed his hat politely and nodded. "Afternoon," he said in a calm voice. Clara leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "Well," she said with a small smile, "we don't get many strangers in Red Hollow. What brings you here, cowboy?" The man stepped closer to the counter. "Just passing through," he replied. Some of the people in the room exchanged looks. Travelers sometimes pass through Red Hollow, but something about this cowboy felt different. Clara noticed it too. She handed him a cup of coffee. "You've been riding for a while," she said. "You look like you could use this." The cowboy nodded in thanks. "My name is Jake Carter." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Clara Bennett," she replied, "owner of this place." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee while looking around the room. His eyes moved carefully, noticing every detail. He seemed calm, but also very aware of everything happening around him. Clara watched him for a moment. Then she smiled slightly and said something playful. "Tell me something, cowboy." Jake looked at her. Clara leaned forward a little and said with a teasing tone, "Is your mind always wandering around strange places when you travel?" A few people in the room chuckled quietly. Jake did not seem embarrassed. Instead, he gave a small smile. "Depends on the place," he answered calmly. Clara laughed softly. "Well, Red Hollow can be an interesting place," she said, "if you stay long enough." Jake did not answer right away. Instead, he looked through the window toward the quiet street outside. The truth was that Jake Carter was not simply passing through. He had come to Red Hollow for a reason. For the past few weeks, Jake had been following a series of strange clues across the desert. Old stories spoke about something hidden somewhere near Red Hollow, something valuable, something people had searched for many years. But treasure was not the only reason. Jake had also heard rumors about a group of dangerous riders moving through the desert at night. And somehow, those riders were connected to this quiet little town. Jake finished his coffee and placed the cup on the counter. Clara studied him again. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" she said. Jake shrugged slightly. "I talk when it matters." Clara smiled. "Well, if you plan on staying in Red Hollow tonight, there's a room upstairs you can rent." Jake nodded. "That might be a good idea." Outside, the wind moved across the empty street again. None of the people inside the saloon noticed the two riders standing far away on a hill, watching the town through the dust. They were not travelers, and they were not friendly. Back inside the saloon, Clara wiped the counter and looked again at the quiet cowboy standing in front of her. Something about him told her that his arrival was not an accident, and she had a strange feeling that life in Red Hollow was about to become much more interesting. Jake Carter had arrived. The next morning in Red Hollow began quietly. The sun slowly rose above the desert hills, painting the sky with soft orange light. Dust moved gently across the empty street as the town woke up for another normal day. But for Jake Carter, It was not a normal day. Jake stepped out of the saloon and looked around the town carefully. His sharp eyes moved from one building to another. He noticed a blacksmith opening his shop, a farmer walking with a sack of grain, and a group of children running down the road. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful. Jake walked toward the horse post and gently patted his horse. Then he looked toward the hills outside the town. Somewhere out there, hidden in the desert, was the answer he had been searching for. Inside the saloon, Clara Bennett was already working. She was placing fresh cups on the counter when Jake walked back in. "You're up early, cowboy," she said with a smile. Jake sat down at the counter. "Habit," he replied. Clara poured him some coffee. "You planning to stay in Red Hollow long?" she asked. Jake took a moment before answering. "Maybe a few days." Clara studied him again. She had met many travelers before, but Jake was different. He always seemed to be thinking about something. "You know," she said, leaning on the counter, "people don't usually stop here unless they're looking for something." Jake raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what makes you think I'm looking for something?" Clara gave a small smile. "Just a feeling." Jake did not answer right away. Instead, he quietly finished his coffee. After a moment, he stood up. "I'm going to take a ride outside town," he said. Clara crossed her arms. "Mind if I ask where?" "Just exploring the desert." Clara thought about it for a second. Then she grabbed her hat from a hook near the door. "Well," she said, "you might get lost out there. Someone should show you the way." Jake looked at her with surprise. "You're coming with me?" Clara smiled confidently. "I know this desert better than most people." A short time later, the two of them rode their horses out of Red Hollow. The desert stretched far in every direction. The wind moved across the sand, and the land looked quiet and endless. As they rode side by side, Clara glanced at Jake. "You still haven't told me the truth," she said. "About what?" Jake asked. "About why you're really here." Jake looked ahead toward the distant hills. "I told you," he said calmly. "Just passing through." Clara laughed softly. "Cowboy, you're not a very good liar." Jake could not help but smile slightly. They rode deeper into the desert, following a narrow path between rocky hills. After some time, Jake slowed his horse and stopped near a group of old stones. He stepped down and walked toward the rocks. Clara watched him curiously. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Jake knelt near the ground and brushed away some sand. Under the sand was a small piece of old metal. Clara's eyes widened. "What is that?" Jake picked it up and studied it carefully. "It's part of an old marker," he said. "Marker for what?" Jake stood up and looked around the desert. "Years ago, someone hid something valuable somewhere near this area." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Treasure?" Jake nodded slightly. "That's the story." Clara looked around the empty land again. "So you came all the way here chasing an old legend?" Jake shook his head. "It's not just a legend." Clara noticed the serious look on his face. "Then why hasn't anyone found it before?" Jake pointed toward the distant hills. "Because someone else has been searching too." Clara frowned. "Who?" Before Jake could answer, he suddenly became very still. He looked toward the top of a nearby hill. Two horses were standing there, and two riders were watching them. Clara noticed them too. "Friends of yours?" she asked quietly. Jake's voice became serious. "No." The riders stayed there for a moment, watching silently. Then they slowly turned their horses and disappeared behind the hill. The desert became quiet again. Clara looked at Jake. "Looks like your treasure story just became more interesting." Jake placed a metal marker in his pocket. "Yes," he said, "and more dangerous." Clara took a deep breath and smiled slightly. "Well, cowboy," she said, "good thing you're not searching alone anymore." Jake looked at her with surprise. "You still want to be part of this?" Clara placed her hat firmly on her head. "I've lived in Red Hollow my whole life," she said. "If someone is hiding secrets in our desert, I want to know about it." Jake thought for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." The wind moved across the sand again as the two riders turned their horses back toward town. But both of them knew something now. Someone else was watching, and whatever was hidden in the desert was important enough for people to follow them. The ride back to Red Hollow was quiet. The sun was slowly going down, and the desert sky turned orange and purple. The wind carried sand across the long, empty road, while Jake Carter and Clara Bennett rode side by side. Neither of them spoke for a while. Both were thinking about the two riders they had seen on the hill. Clara was the first to break the silence. "So," she said, glancing at Jake, "those men in the desert, they're looking for the same thing, right?" Jake nodded slowly. "Yes." "Treasure hunters?" "Maybe," Jake replied. "Or maybe something else." Clara frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Jake looked toward the town ahead. "If people are willing to watch strangers from a distance, it means they don't want to be seen yet." Clara understood what he meant. They're planning something. Jake didn't answer, but the serious look on his face confirmed her guess. When they finally reached Red Hollow, the town looked peaceful as always. A few lanterns were lit along the street, and people were slowly gathering inside the saloon for the evening. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. But Jake had learned something during his years of traveling. Sometimes the most dangerous places look calm on the surface. Inside the saloon, Clara began preparing dinner for the guests. The warm smell of food filled the room as people talked and laughed at the tables. Jake sat quietly in the corner, watching the room carefully. His eyes moved from one person to another. Most of the faces were familiar town locals. But one man caught his attention. The man sat alone at a table near the window. He wore a dark coat and kept his hat low over his face. Every few minutes he glanced toward the door, as if waiting for someone. Jake leaned slightly closer to Clara when she passed by. "Who's that man?" he asked quietly. Clara looked toward the table. "Oh," she said, "that's Mr. Dalton." "Dalton? He's been in town for a few weeks," Clara explained. "Says he's a trader. Buys supplies and sells them to travelers." Jake kept watching the man. "Does he talk much?" Clara shook her head. "Not really. Mostly keeps to himself." Jake thought about that. Something about Dalton felt wrong. Across the room, Dalton slowly lifted his head and noticed Jake looking at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then Dalton quickly looked away. Jake leaned back in his chair. Clara noticed the tension. "You think he's connected to those riders?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Jake replied. Just then, the saloon door opened. A young boy rushed inside, breathing hard. "Miss Clara," he shouted. Clara walked over quickly. "What happened, Tim?" The boy tried to catch his breath. "I was near the old well outside town," he said, "and I saw two strange riders hiding behind the rocks." Jake stood up immediately. Clara's expression became serious. "The same riders from the desert?" she asked. The boy nodded. They were watching the town. The room became quiet as people heard the news. Jake walked to the door and looked outside into the dark street. The lantern light flickered softly in the wind. "They're getting closer," he said. Clara walked beside him. "Do you think they're coming tonight?" Jake looked toward the hills in the distance. "Maybe not tonight," he said, "but soon." Clara crossed her arms. "Then we need to be ready." Jake nodded. "Yes." They stepped outside the saloon together. The night air was cool, and the town looked peaceful under the stars. But Jake knew better. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the hills, people were watching and waiting. Clara looked at him. "You still haven't told me everything," she said. Jake sighed slightly. "You're right." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small metal marker they had found in the desert earlier. "This is part of an old trail system," he explained. Clara studied it closely. "What kind of trail?" Jake looked toward the mountains far away. "A hidden route that leads to something valuable." "Treasure?" Jake nodded. "But not just gold." Clara looked confused. "What else could it be?" Jake spoke quietly. "Something powerful enough that people have been searching for years." At that moment, a distant sound echoed from the hills. The faint sound of horses moving through the night. Clara heard it too. She looked toward the dark horizon. "They're out there," she whispered. Jake placed a marker back in his pocket. "Yes," he said, "and now they know we're looking too." The wind blew across the empty street as the two of them stood there. The mystery of Red Hollow was growing deeper. The night in Red Hollow was quiet, but the silence fell heavy. A cool wind moved through the empty streets while lanterns flickered outside the wooden buildings. Most of the townspeople had already gone home, but Jake Carter and Clara Bent were still awake inside the saloon. Both of them were thinking about the sounds they had heard earlier from the hills. Someone was watching the town. Jake stood near the window, looking out into the darkness. His eyes carefully studied the quiet road. Clara walked over and placed 2 cups of coffee on a small table. "You should sit down for a moment," she said. "You've been staring out that window for a long time." Jake turned and gave a small smile before sitting down. "I've learned something from traveling," he said. "What's that?" Clara asked. "Trouble usually arrives when people stop paying attention." Clara nodded slowly. "Well, Red Hollow has been peaceful for many years. I'd like to keep it that way." Jake understood what she meant. For a moment, the saloon was silent except for the sound of the wind outside. Then suddenly the door opened. The same young boy from earlier, Tim, stepped inside again. This time he looked excited rather than scared. "Miss Clara," he said, "I saw those riders again." Jake and Clara both stood up quickly. "Where?" Jake asked. "Near the old canyon road," Tim replied. "They were riding away from town." Jake looked thoughtful. "They're moving," he said. Clara frowned. "But why ride away if they were watching us?" Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the small metal marker again. "I think they already found what they were looking for." Clara looked surprised. "You mean the hidden trail?" Jake nodded. "The canyon road leads to the place where the old markers used to guide travelers." Clara grabbed her hat immediately. "Then we should go there." Jake looked at the dark sky outside. "It's late," he said. Clara gave him a confident smile. "Cowboy, if someone is messing with the desert near my town, I'm not waiting until morning." Jake could not argue with that. A few minutes later, they were both riding their horses out of Red Hollow once again. The moon lit the desert with pale silver light. The path toward the canyon twisted between tall rocks and dry bushes. After some time, they reached the narrow canyon road. Jake slowed his horse. "Look," he said quietly. Near the side of the canyon wall was an old wooden post partly buried in the sand. Jake stepped down and walked closer. Carved into the wood was a faded symbol. Clara joined him. "What does it mean?" Jake brushed the sand away and studied the carving. "It's a sign used by travelers many years ago," he explained. "A marker that shows safe water routes across the desert." Clara blinked in surprise. "Water routes." Jake nodded. "Long ago, explorers hid these markers to guide people toward hidden water sources. In this desert, water was more valuable than gold." Clara looked around the canyon. "So the treasure wasn't gold at all." Jake smiled slightly. "No." He pointed toward a group of rocks nearby. Behind them was a small hidden spring where clear water slowly flowed into a shallow pool. Clara's eyes widened. This could help travelers for generations. Jake nodded. That's why the markers were protected. Clara suddenly understood. Those riders wanted to find it so they could control the water. Jake agreed. If someone controls water in the desert, they control everything. Just then, a sound came from behind them. Hoofbeats. Jake and Clara turned quickly. The 2 mysterious riders appeared at the entrance of the canyon. But instead of causing trouble, they looked surprised to see Jake and Clara already there. One of the riders spoke. "You found it before us." Jake remained calm. "This water belongs to everyone." The riders looked at each other for a moment. Then the older rider sighed. "We were hoping to claim it for ourselves," he admitted. "But maybe that's not the right thing to do." Clara stepped forward confidently. "This spring can help travelers survive the desert. It should stay open to everyone." The riders slowly nodded. After a moment, they turned their horses and rode away into the night without another word. The canyon became quiet again. Clara looked at Jake and smiled. "Well, Cowboy," she said playfully, "looks like the mystery of Red Hollow wasn't about treasure after all." Jake laughed softly. "No," he said. "Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that help everyone." They stood there for a moment, listening to the gentle sound of the hidden spring. Then Clara looked at Jake with a teasing grin. "So tell me something." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What?" Clara laughed. Now that the mystery is solved, are you still planning to just pass through Red Hollow? Jake looked toward the peaceful desert, then back toward the town in the distance. For the first time since arriving, he seemed relaxed. Maybe I'll stay a while, he said. Clara smiled. I had a feeling you might. Under quiet desert sky, the two riders turned their horses toward home.